It's been another busy week here at First Baptist, as everyone up here has said. It takes a lot of hard work to move a group of a couple dozen children from square one on Monday all the way to performing a musical on Friday night, Broadway on Friday night. And so I think this was an awesome success. And I just want to extend my thanks to the team and the many hours spent putting something like that together. And I can speak for all of us in the room when I say how grateful I am and how proud we are of you, because that has made all the difference. I'm grateful this morning. Yes, let's clap. I'm grateful this morning to address you again for the second time in a row. Ever since January, when our interim started and the search for our next senior pastor began in earnest, I've spoken with quite a few of you who've expressed to me how much they appreciate the chance to hear different preachers every Sunday. And so to you, I'm sorry that I'm here again. But there is something to that, right? There's something special about hearing a lot of diversity up here, a diversity of perspectives and styles and personalities. And I think that it's been great for me and for many of the others who we've invited to be a part of this service. I've said it before, I don't take this opportunity lightly. I don't take this opportunity that is also a responsibility lightly. And no one should, but especially for someone like me who's practicing preaching and interested in preaching, the chance to fill this pulpit on a Sunday, and this pulpit in particular, because you all know me and yet love me and are patient with me and are gracious with me. That means the world. It's an incredible gift. There's a risk, too, during an interim. And it's always serious, it's serious. It's not often manifest, but we need to mention it anyway, because we can get used to having a kind of novelty, a different face every week, can't we? And when we do, we might start listening a bit more to our preferences for a certain style or a certain personality, because chances are, as pastors revolve, you will get your token set of favorite qualities every so often. And someday soon, we're going to be welcoming a pastor who will most likely occupy this post on most Sunday mornings, and we'll have thoughts about that person's preaching too, about how they sound, about what they say. We'll have a lot of thoughts about how long it takes for them to say it. And so we need to remember that these preferences that we have for things that you might like about me or dislike about me, for example, those things are inevitable. But they can distract us, if we're not careful, from something much more significant that is happening in this moment, which is the proclamation of God's word. This isn't motivational speaking. This isn't 6 steps from a 33-year-old about living your best life. It's none of that. This is about the proclamation and instruction and the hearing of words that are not my own. And it is the burden of every Christian and every churchgoer to learn how to hear the voice of God in the words of another person. And that's something you have to do with me, and it's something you'll have to do with the senior pastor when he's called, and it will be something that you have to deal with each other as you're in Bible studies, listening to teachers. And so I hope that you can hear his voice this morning. That is my goal and my aim. Last week, we started a 2-part cliffhanging, impossible to binge because the second part didn't yet exist, right? It's one of those shows that only comes on every week and you have to wait for it. Mini-series called How to Carry a Cross. And we began to look together at the Gospel of Luke. We started in chapter 9, verses 23 through 27. And this morning we're actually going to jump ahead a couple chapters to Luke chapter 14. But the thing that holds these two pericopes, if you wanted to use a fancy word, together, the thing that holds these two together is a reference that Jesus makes to carrying your cross. And that the 2 instances in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus uses this phrase to describe discipleship. And so we're going to be in Luke chapter 14, and we're going to be reading verses 25 through 35. So follow along on the screen as I read it for us. Luke writes this: large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone will see it and ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he isn't able, he'll send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's neither fit for the soil nor for the manure pile. It's thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. So last week we talked about cross-bearing as a decision both to deny ourselves, but also to understand suffering and by extension our whole lives as an opportunity, a chance to relate our story back to the story of God. This week I want us to talk about cross-bearing as a reevaluation of our expectations. Expectations about what we hope to get out of discipleship, the fruit and the reward of this particular relationship that we have with Jesus, but then also expectations about what will be required of us too. Things which may at times clash with what life spent following Jesus actually looks like. And before I give you my plan, something important needs to be said. Both Luke 9 and Luke 14 seem to be directed towards people who are too enthusiastic. And that's an odd thing to say, but it's actually pretty clear in the text. Did you notice how this passage began? It says kind of subtly, large crowds were following Jesus. These are people who are literally following him, right? Pursuing him, shadowing him every move that he makes as he's on his way to Jerusalem. He's not interacting with people who aren't interested in him. He isn't trying to convince stubborn people that he's right. He's offering a corrective for those who might be overeager, which I think makes these passages that much more relevant for the instruction of this body, for the church. You and I have shown at least as much enthusiasm as it takes to get up out of bed on a perfectly good Sunday morning and drive to church and listen to a sermon and sing songs together and be intentionally in the community of other Christians. And so it's fair to say, I guess, that most of us in the room are probably enthusiastic about following Jesus. And so his response is for us, even as it was directed towards the crowd. It's a sobering response. It's not dismissive. It's not judgmental, but it's abrasive. And that makes it worth a careful listen, especially for us. So I want to look at two things this morning in the time that we have together. First, I want to look at hatred, which you see Jesus mention in the first few verses that we read quite awkwardly. And then second, we need to think about counting costs, which he talks about in verses 28 through 33. So that's the plan. Hatred and counting costs. Here Jesus is, surrounded by zealous supporters around him, flanking him like the paparazzi, right? For those of you who've seen A Hard Day's Night, this is Jesus mania, right? And the first thing out of his mouth, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father or mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, even their own life, even themselves, such a person cannot be my disciple. It's as if Jesus was playing a game where the goal was for him to lose as much popularity using as few words as possible. But the truth is, this crowd doesn't yet understand what Jesus is about. Luke has been quite clear by this point where Jesus is going. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and it's going to take him a long time in the Gospel of Luke. And he's going there to be crucified. But the ones following him are expecting something a little bit more impressive. Maybe a political revolt. Maybe the overturning of the religious establishment. Maybe a confrontation with a Roman governor or prefect. And taking all that into account, this is what he says to them. This is the first thing out of his mouth. So what does he mean? Now, clearly, we lack the scriptural basis not only to hate our family, but to hate ourselves. In fact, to honor our father and mother, as many of your father and mothers painstakingly reminded you, is the only one of the 10 Commandments with a built-in reward, right? That if you can love your father and your mother, then you will live a long time. And that's an undeniable tenet of Jesus' teaching. Maybe not even loving family, but loving indiscriminately. Loving neighbor and enemy alike, which means that whatever Jesus is talking about here, he doesn't mean for us to hate anyone. So again, what is this hard saying? Now, typically, we interpret it as a kind of hyperbole. We assume that the use of the word hate that Jesus is using right here is really just intended to establish a kind of comparison, that our regard for our family and for ourselves ought to look like hate in comparison, right, to the regard that we have for Jesus. And if that's right, then all Jesus means is that we should place our loves in a kind of hierarchy, an order, that we should love appropriately and grant our relationship with God priority even over our closest human relationships. Augustine thought that the Christian life was essentially this, that what it meant to have faith was to correctly reorder our loves, because sin at its root was disordered love. And faith has to put all of these things back in order. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but I think there's a more compelling explanation. When Jesus tells the disciples that they must hate their family, I think what he means is to stress that in order for us to function as his disciples, we have to become, in some real sense, made alone. Not alone meaning without support or without people who care about us, or even without this body or a body like it, without the church. But it does mean alone in the sense of being fully and independently responsible. Jesus' call to become a disciple as a way of isolating us necessarily, of making us cut ties with every other obligation. And that's because the only way a person gets to become a disciple or to live as a disciple is by making a decision for themselves that only they can make. There was a kid at VBS who asked me as sincerely as I've ever heard it asked before, if the fact that her parents and grandparents were Christians had anything to do with whether she was a Christian. And I told her that it makes conditions as optimal as possible, right? That it is an immeasurable gift to grow up in a Christian household. But without these precedents, which are luxuries really, these role models, this heritage of faith, still the only way to come to Jesus is by a decision that you make yourself. Or just self, as my 1-year-old is fond of saying. Self. That seems to be what Jesus is driving home here in this first statement. It's not a comment primarily about hierarchy or how we relate to our families. It's a comment about the ability of any tie, any connection, however good, however noble, however assumed to be in line with Jesus, to infringe upon the kind of exclusive claim that's reserved for him and him alone. So I don't think this is about hyperbole or hierarchy. It's about disentanglement. Paul says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 7, and I apologize to all the married folks in the room. He said, I'd like for you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of the world, how he can please his wife. And his interests, Paul says, are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, Paul says, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Undivided. See what I mean? The call of discipleship is a call that renders us alone. It requires us to sever ties with anything and everything that has any viable claim over our loyalty. We can't pretend that we're his disciples if we reserve even some small, seemingly insignificant place for someone or something to rule us. We have to disentangle ourselves. There's one commentator put it, I love this word, we must be disencumbered. And it's not just family that he points to here. In verse 33 he says, those of you who do not give up everything cannot be my disciples. That is a wide net. It's our possessions, it's our wealth, it's our security, it's our influence. Jesus knows how many things can claim our attention and how carefully we must guard his place in our affections. Now, I can't preach twice in a row without quoting Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because that would be an unforgivable tragedy, as I'm sure you would agree. So, let me share something that he says about this very thing. He writes, Jesus' call to discipleship makes the disciple into a single individual. Whether disciples want to or not, they have to make a decision. Each has to decide alone. It's not their own choice to desire to be single individuals. Listen to that carefully. It's not their own choice to desire to be single individuals. Instead, Christ makes everyone he calls into an individual. Each is called alone. Each must follow alone. And out of fear of loneliness, a human being seeks safety in the people and things around them. Under their cover, they want to make their decision. But they do not want to stand up alone in front of Jesus, to have to decide with only Jesus in view. But at that moment, neither father nor mother, neither spouse nor child, neither nation nor history cover a person being called. Christ intends to make the human being lonely. As individuals, they see nothing except him who called them. Now let me clarify something just briefly, because this sounds pretty odd for a preacher to say, right? The Christian life is not some ascetic, self-flagellating, individual existence. It's not about pursuing loneliness for loneliness' sake. And so where's the church? Where's the community? Where does the call of individuals into discipleship converge with the calling of multiple Christians into discipleship? And there's another place where Jesus talks about family that's related. It comes in Matthew 12. His mother and his brothers are looking for him. They have something to tell him. And they come and find him, and they want to speak with him. And Jesus replies, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And then pointing to his disciples around the room where he's seated, he says, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So that's it, isn't it? These individual disciples, these people who've had to make decisions for themselves, decisions that have demanded a kind of brutal, often lonely responsibility, they are thereafter freed to relate to one another in a new way. They become something else. They become the church. They become this new family, an adopted family, a family of the disencumbered, you might say, which is probably not what you were hoping for. That doesn't feel great if your family means something to you, or if your family is everything to you. But friends, there's not some text lurking out there that qualifies these words out of existence. Nor do I think, by that same token, and I've got to be clear, that Jesus would ever endorse us abandoning our children or leaving our spouses. But his consolation consistently is not the life we share in our marriages or with our kids. This isn't just a psychological metaphor that Jesus is using here. His consolation is the church. And for those for whom following Jesus has meant a fracture in the relationship they have with their parents or their siblings or their friends, families are seen more clearly as comforts that Jesus' call to discipleship may actually cost us. Last time, the hatred of self came to the fore as self-denial. But here, the focus sits more on our relationship to the outside world, to the other people, a denial of even the things that we love the most, the people that we love the most. Let's move on, though, now to talk about counting costs. And this is actually where Jesus spends most of his time in our passage. He brings up two illustrations to make his point. The first has to do with building a tower. And he asks the crowd to imagine that they're considering the prospect of constructing a tower. You know, like we always do. We get up in the morning. Should we build a tower today? I don't know. So, put yourself there. This tower is probably less Eiffel and more watchtower or guard tower, right? Something that you'd set up to guard your property, something that you could climb up to make sure that everything's going well. And granted, that's probably still a stretch hypothetical for this crowd that probably doesn't own a lot of land, probably doesn't have a lot of property to oversee, but I digress. That's not the point. His question for them is, won't you sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete this tower? Because if you don't, he says, everyone will see you and ridicule you for not finishing. And the second illustration is about a king. Jesus asked the crowd whether a king who's about to make war with another king should sit down and determine whether he has the strength to secure a victory. And if he doesn't, then wouldn't it be reasonable for him, Jesus says, to send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace? Now, taken together, it's likely that these two parables are playing a kind of double duty, because not only are they trying to teach his enthusiastic crowd something about what it means to follow him, but they're probably also subtle jabs at King Herod, who as a ruler was often trying to build towers that he couldn't afford and wage wars that he couldn't win. So his fans would have chuckled at these illustrations. Now, I don't think these are super complicated examples, but they're actually more difficult to sum up than they seem at first. I'm tempted, especially with the tower, to make out the moral of the lesson to be something about persistence, right? After all, that seems to be what the crowd listening to him might be lacking. So maybe they're like the person who lays the foundation for the tower, but once Jesus actually gets to Jerusalem and has to suffer all that he's bound to suffer, maybe their enthusiastic support will start to dwindle, and that's what Jesus is warning them about. He's saying that they'll be ridiculed for their lack of foresight, for their lack of follow-through. But that doesn't quite work, because the story isn't about a person making a decision about whether to push through or not after they've started. It's about how prudent it is for him to determine well in advance, before he starts, whether or not he can actually afford it. And so it's not quite a call to persistence. It's a call to a kind of measured evaluation, isn't it? Jesus wants us to think about discipleship before we actually embark on discipleship. Because once we do, these stories tend to illustrate how disastrous it might be if we haven't thought about it before, if we haven't done our homework. And the second story about the king is even more difficult, because the decision he has to make is more or less lose-lose. If you read carefully, he isn't deciding about whether or not to go to war. He's at war. Whether or not he wants to be or not, the decision he makes is whether he'll march into a battle that he can't win or decide instead to send a delegation and ask for a truce. But either way, it's a tough road. He doesn't get to decide whether he has what it takes to go to war, to build the tower. He just has to decide how much he's willing to give up. And that makes it even stranger to apply to this call to discipleship. What did it mean to the crowd? And what does it mean for us? You know, some scholars believe that these aren't just parables that outline our decisions. They're not just jabs at Herod either, but they also might serve as veiled descriptions of the kind of commitment that God has made to us. God has not undertaken a mission in Jesus that he isn't going to bring to completion. Even if that completion doesn't look as successful as we think it might, even if it looks like sending a delegation and striking a peace agreement. So that's one interesting possibility here. After mulling it over, where I feel the force of these two illustrations hit the ground is on their focus on humiliation. Notice that there isn't some explanatory verse here. It would be really great for Peter to stand up and say, Jesus, we don't know what you're saying, tell us. We don't get that. There's only verse 33 that says we must give up everything if we're to be Jesus' disciples. So whereas last week that meant our lives, this week it seems like it means our pride. Like I said already, the guy who wants to build the tower gets a choice. And Jesus seems to be warning us that we shouldn't embark on this journey with him unless we know what it's about, unless we're willing to give up what it requires. But the king's story is different because his decision leads to humiliation either way, be it in defeat or in a negotiated settlement where his opponent has the upper hand. His opponent is the one with the 20,000 troops. And so it seems like Jesus is telling us to be like the king, to humble ourselves, to send out the delegation before we lose the battle that we could never win in the first place. Both examples end in humiliation. Both suggest that to follow him means to relinquish our pride, to quite literally make ourselves humble, right? Humiliation, humilityization. The reason I think it matters that we count the cost in advance, backing up a little bit. First is that we can't be a disciple unless the cross is carried, unless that cost is paid. To choose this is necessarily to lose something. It's not just about the glory and the victory. It's not just about potential loss. It's about this negotiated settlement, this humiliation that is required. And so we must be discerning. We need to have a picture of precisely what Jesus is requiring of us. Otherwise, we'll be pretty disappointed when we get to Jerusalem. And if you haven't committed to Jesus yet, then maybe that's the decision before you. Is it worth it? Is what Jesus is requiring of me worth it? And to answer that question is to stare into the kind of humiliation that it will require of you right in the face. There's not some other version of the gospel that allows you to jump over the threshold. The threshold is that cost. And there's another important reason why we need to count the cost of being his disciple. Because it's possible that we're signing up for something that we don't understand. We might have our own expectations about what life with Jesus is going to look like. Expectations that have arisen from that haven't arisen from his promises or his commands, but from our own desires and from our own wishful thinking. We might be just like the crowd who thinks that following Jesus is going to bring them a measure of political or economic success. And the risk there isn't just disappointment. It's not just ridicule. It's our lives, right? As Luke 9 said, our efforts will be revealed to be self-serving. We'll wind up losing ourselves by struggling to save ourselves. But if we can seek humility as Jesus is asking us to, if we can follow him, knowing what he demands, then we'll be gaining everything in exchange for what we're giving up. It's like that famous quote, he's no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose, or to gain what he cannot earn, you might say. Friends, Jesus isn't someone we can know, nor are his benefits something we can enjoy without experiencing cost. Grace is free, yes, but it will change the course of your life in some key ways. It will matter. It will decide for you where your loyalties lie, or it will not be grace. So let me try to wrap things up this way, and not just today's sermon, but these two passages that we've looked at today and last week. I mentioned last time, and this time I guess, that the thing that they have in common is this idea of cross-carrying, right? These are the two occasions in Luke's gospel where Jesus uses the idea of carrying a cross to describe our relationship with him. But the other similarity between Luke 9 and Luke 14 is this conditional kind of phrasing that he uses. So in Luke 9, it has a really clear imperative force, doesn't it? Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Here in Luke 4, it's a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more descriptive, but the force is the same. If anyone comes to me and does not hate their mother, their brother, their father, so on, such a person cannot be my disciple. Now, it's almost too obvious to mention, but those conditions, those ultimatums, those are the defining characteristics of these two calls into a life of following Jesus. Which means, friends, that there is a choice to be made. There are conditions to be met. There are two possible outcomes. And here, the reason Jesus has been highlighting the need to count cost is ultimately because presumably after they count the cost, these enthusiastic supporters of his may decide the price is too high. These stories and the strange talk about hating family, these things might convince them to abandon their fascination with Jesus. That's a lethal possibility, isn't it? But it's all too likely. It's impossible to take this any other way. Decide now what you're willing to pay. Because just like the salt that loses its flavor, enthusiasm, interest, fascination, habit, that stuff isn't worth putting in the dirt. Church, this is obviously not Jesus' attempt at lowering the bar of entry. This is Jesus' challenge to those who would come and follow him, that doing so will be demanding. It's a word of caution, a warning that there's a way to be initially drawn to him and his mission before fully grappling with what it may require. So for so many of us, for people who think that their life is about their own self-gratification without any shame or remorse, then this life of self-denial is not the least bit attractive. To someone who savors the ability to make decisions for themselves, following Jesus isn't desirable. To those of us who prioritize other things, who reserve secret allegiances while giving Jesus the lion's share, the more visible, the vast majority of our attention, then these words are challenging. And that's the kind of choice that we're offered today and every day. Would you pray with me? Father, you're a good God, and we thank you for being here. We thank you for your Spirit's work in our hearts, convicting us and bringing to light and editing and refining this experience that we have of listening to your word proclaimed. Lord, we pray that as we chew on this hard saying, Lord, that we would be like Peter, who, after hearing that he needed to eat your flesh and drink your blood, and as crowds are running away in terror, you asked him what kept him there. And he said, where would we go? Because you have the words of life. And so I pray that these hard words would be words of life. I pray that we would see the call to discipleship not as a burden to be ignored, but Lord, as the only way to reach this negotiated peace. We love you, and we ask all these things in the name of your Son. Amen.
Please stand.